Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, the key to PMP exam success. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Hello and welcome back to the Project Management Prepcast, where we engage your brain with the best PMP instruction available. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner. In this lesson, we discuss the control stakeholder engagement process, which is the fourth process of the Manage Project Stakeholders knowledge area. Stakeholder engagement is key to the success on any project, and controlling stakeholder engagement will increase the efficiency and effectiveness of your project. So in this lesson, we will explain the main concept behind stakeholder engagement and how to control it effectively. We look at the information needed to keep stakeholders engaged in your project, including things like the issues log and performance data. We discuss project documentation and communication and why those are important to the process. We cover the importance of expert judgment on your project and how to utilize it effectively for the process. We talk about raw data and how it is transformed into usable work performance information and what the difference is between raw and contextualized information. And finally, we will cover the importance of the lessons learned and other assets that are generated from this process and how they can help future projects. Let's start out with the definition of the project stakeholder management knowledge area, which includes the processes that are required to identify the people, groups, or organizations that could impact or be impacted by the project, to analyze stakeholder expectations and their impact on the project, and to develop appropriate management strategies for effectively engaging stakeholders in project decisions and execution. We have four processes in this knowledge area, and stakeholder management is one of those knowledge areas, those few knowledge areas, where the first process, the name of the process, does not start with the word plan. It starts with the word identify. Identify stakeholders is our first process. It's the process of identifying all people, groups, or organizations that could impact or be impacted by a decision, activity, or outcome of the project, and analyzing and documenting relevant information regarding their interests, involvement, interdependencies, influence, and potential impact on project success. Once we have that out of the way, then we move on to the planning process, to the planned stakeholder management process. This is the process of developing appropriate management strategies to effectively engage stakeholders throughout the project lifecycle based on their needs, interests, and potential impact on project success. Once we have the planning out of the way, we move on to the manage stakeholder engagement process. This is the process of communicating and working with stakeholders to meet their needs, expectations, address issues as they occur, and foster appropriate stakeholder engagement in project activities throughout the project lifecycle. And finally, the last process in this knowledge area, just like many others, begins with the word control. Control stakeholder engagement. This is the process of monitoring overall project stakeholder relationships and adjusting strategies and plans for engaging our stakeholders. And this table here, our overview table that shows you into which process group our processes fall, explains why our first process in this knowledge area does not start with the word plan, but with the word identify. Identify stakeholders is part of the initiating process group. Plan stakeholder management, obviously a planning process, manage stakeholder engagement and executing process, and our focus right now, control stakeholder engagement, that is monitoring and controlling. There's obviously nothing to close in the project stakeholder management knowledge area. Therefore, we don't have a fifth process that falls into closing. So we're only using the first 4 process groups. The main concept to understand behind this process is that we monitor the overall project stakeholder relationships to keep our stakeholders engaged in the project. As you may recall, a stakeholder is defined as an individual, group or organization who may affect, be affected by, or perceive itself to be affected by a decision, activity or outcome of our project. This can sometimes require that we adjust our strategies and plan to keep these stakeholders engaged. And that's fine. That is preferable actually, because then we can continually improve our relationship with them. The key benefit of the process is that it will maintain or increase the efficiency and effectiveness of stakeholder engagement activities as the project evolves and its environment changes. Let's review our ITTOs for the control stakeholder engagement process. You'll notice that there are a lot more outputs here than there are inputs in the process. This is because we take our inputs like the project management plan and the issues log, and we apply tools and techniques like information management systems and meetings to then create updates. We do all of this to keep our stakeholders engaged and to keep our stakeholder relationships as a priority. We change things to keep stakeholders satisfied. We update the project management plan to keep things in line with expectations, and we update our lessons learned in form of our organizational process assets for use in future projects. Let's look at the details. Here are the inputs to the control stakeholder engagement process. They are the project management plan, the issues log, work performance data, and project documents. As a general rule, we can say that these are all inputs that are used so that we can review them, analyze them, and answer the question, are our stakeholder management activities effective in engaging our stakeholders on this project? Let's take a look at how this is done. The project management plan, according to the PMBOK guide, is the document that describes how the project will be executed, monitored, and controlled. So why then is the project management plan an input for this process? Well, one reason is because it contains a lot of information that is necessary to control stakeholder engagement. How will you keep your stakeholders engaged in your project if you don't have the plan that outlines how you're going to do this in the first place? The project management plan also contains information regarding the life cycle and the processes of your project. Without this information, how will stakeholders know what phase the project is in or how to create necessary changes? This is important information. Human resources, roles, and project responsibilities are a few more examples of information that we find in the project management plan that is important for this process. Reporting relationships and staffing management are addressed as well. Important information for stakeholders. Another reason why the project management plan is an input for this process is because it contains stakeholder communication preferences and techniques. Stakeholders need to be communicated with according to the communications management plan, which is a subsidiary document in the overall project management plan. Also remember that we want to adjust any stakeholder engagement tasks that are not performing as expected, and much of that is documented in the project management plan as well. Our second input, the issue log, is important to this process because you need to keep track of project issues and you use this log to help resolve those issues. Resolved issues equals happy stakeholders. The log itself helps you to track and monitor issues and items that are important to project stakeholders. If a new issue comes up or something needs to be updated, it will be included here. This is important because you need to track these issues on your project. If you don't track issues, they will get to be bigger and bigger problems and eventually cause the failure of your project as a whole. If you do not monitor what is currently being discussed, how will you track progress on your project? And how will you keep track of what has and has not been talked about yet? You don't want to keep asking stakeholders whether their concerns were addressed only to realize that someone else has already done that. This is all information that is part of your issues log. As for disputes, can you imagine not keeping a log of those? Your problems will start to multiply if they are not handled. If key stakeholders or sponsors have severe disputes and you fail to address them, let alone keep track of them, what do you think will happen to your project? Well, it will fail. That is what will happen. Work performance data is next. It is described as the raw observations and measurements identified during activities being performed to carry out the project work. This covers a wide variety of measurements on project activities and deliverables which are collected during various controlling processes. This information is provided as an input to this process because it is very important information for your stakeholders to have. If you have stakeholders asking for updates on how your project is going, what will you say if you don't have this information? Will you just make up some performance numbers? Or how will you communicate schedule information? This input also contains information like the reported percentage of work completed, technical performance measures, start and finish dates of schedule activities, number of change requests, number of defects, actual costs and duration, and so on. Do you think that stakeholders are interested in this information? Of course they are. Without defect information, how will you know that your project is in control? Without cost and duration information, how will you or your stakeholders know that your project is on track? Well, they wouldn't. Documents coming from initiating, planning, executing or controlling processes will be used as supporting inputs for controlling stakeholder engagement. Here are some examples. Without the correct schedule, how are you going to let your stakeholders know that you are on track? If they have no idea if you are on schedule or not, your stakeholder engagement will suffer. If you don't include the stakeholder register as an input here, how will you know who all of your stakeholders are, especially on a very, very large project? If you don't know your stakeholders, how will you keep them engaged? The change log is included here because you and your stakeholders need a way to keep track of all the project's changes over time. Without this information, your stakeholders will not know whether a requested change has been implemented or even if the change is on your radar. Project communication is also an important project document. Communication is a huge part of a successful project, and if you want to keep your stakeholders engaged, you will communicate with them often. Perhaps your CEO wants a weekly status update emailed to him every Friday morning, or your CTO wants a daily status report on server performance and load while processing your project tasks. If you ignore these communications, you are going to have a bad time. But most importantly, by having these types of documents as inputs to our process, we can review that they are and were in fact created, that the information was given to our stakeholders, and we can make an assessment to learn if they helped us effectively manage and engage our stakeholders. And frankly, the last bullet that you see here on this slide, review and ensure that they support effective stakeholder engagement and management, this bullet could and should have been the last bullet on all our explanations for all of our inputs that we have seen so far. So each of our 4 inputs, the project management plan, the issues log, work performance data, and project documents, help us in assessing and ensuring that stakeholder engagement and management is effective. There are 3 tools and techniques in the control stakeholder engagement process: information management systems, expert judgment, and meetings. So the first, information management system, these are facilities, processes, and procedures used to collect, store, and distribute information between producers and consumers of information in physical or electronic format. The second is the use of expert judgment. This is judgment provided based upon expertise in an application area, knowledge area, discipline, industry, and so on, as is appropriate for the activity that we're performing. Such expertise may be provided by any group or person with specialized education, knowledge, skill, or experience or training. And finally, we use meetings as well. Yes, meetings. Everybody knows what a meeting is. But there are different types of meetings, and how to handle each one varies depending on the situation. So our first tool and technique are the information management systems. And the PMBOK guide, as we just heard on the previous slide, describes this as facilities, processes, and procedures used to collect, store, and distribute information between producers and consumers of information in physical or electronic format. An information system, therefore, allows you as the project manager to capture, store, and distribute information to stakeholders about the project cost, schedule, progress, and performance. The system can be physical or electronic. You could distribute reports either by printing them and mailing them off, or by sending them as emails, right? It's the same concept. Although if you use an electronic system, it usually makes it easier to consolidate reports, especially if you need to get and produce financial reports, staffing reports, and distribute them to stakeholders nationwide. And the reports, they come to you in the raw format from different systems. A few examples of distribution formats may be table reporting, spreadsheet analysis, or presentations like PowerPoints. PowerPoint makes it very easy to create visual representations of project information and communicate that information to your stakeholders. Here is why our second tool and technique, expert judgment, is important to this process. As you recall, expert judgment is judgment provided based on expertise in an application area, knowledge area, discipline, or industry, as it is appropriate for the activity being performed. So, expert judgment should be sought out to ensure that we have a comprehensive identification and listing of new stakeholders. We need to review the list of current stakeholders, and if there are any new stakeholders, they need to be added to the list. Expert judgment can be acquired either through individual consultation, like a one-on-one meeting or an interview, or in a focus group, a panel, or via a survey. For example, you could ask senior management who they consider to be key stakeholders on your project. Or you can ask your chief operating officers questions like, how do you think our project is perceived by the CEO? Is there room for improving our engagement with him? These are all very important questions, and you will use their expert judgment to get the answers. You could also ask various professional groups, technical organizations, or even regulatory bodies for input on your project. The key is finding the appropriate expert and asking the correct and relevant question to controlling stakeholder engagement. And you may also use expert judgment to perform a stakeholder reassessment. Perhaps a group could be considered considered a stakeholder in the past, like a government body, for instance, but they're no longer relevant for the project today. Use expert judgment and find out. And then finally, meetings. Everyone is familiar with meetings, and you have probably been in more than a few of these already. You get the team together. This can be done either in person or through teleconferencing capabilities. Technology can help get everyone together, and even when they are worlds apart. The point of these meetings is for status review. You don't want to get everyone together just to give them stale information or for no reason at all. That wastes everybody's time, and your stakeholders will not be happy if you do that. In these meetings, you exchange and analyze information about stakeholder engagement. If areas of improvement are noted, then you will know what to do and how to improve your stakeholder engagement after the meeting is over. Believe it or not, meetings are actually a good way to improve stakeholder engagement. You can get everyone together, involve them in the project, and get them to interact on a better level amongst themselves and with you. These are all really good things for your project. We are moving on to the outputs of this process. We have 5, which are the work performance information, change requests, and then we have updates to the project management plan, the project documents, and the organizational process assets. Remember that the main goal of this process is to ensure or improve the effectiveness of our stakeholder engagement activities. So consequently, we create all of these outputs because we want to improve our relationships with our stakeholders. Each output helps us do that. And do you remember that on the last slide for our inputs, I said that all our inputs help us to review and ensure that they support effective stakeholder engagement and management? Well, it's quite similar here in our outputs. So as we review each output on the following slides, please remember that each of them is created to ensure effective and efficient stakeholder engagement. You may consider that this is the last bullet on each slide. We create them to ensure that we have effective and efficient stakeholder engagement. Work performance information is the performance data collected from various controlling processes. It is analyzed in context and integrated based on relationships across areas. The work performance data, which was one of our inputs, through this process has now been transformed into work performance information. This information is correlated and contextualized. It's not just taken as raw data, because without context, the meaning would be misinterpreted. Misinterpreted information is just as bad as getting bad or no information at all. Without context, this data can be useless for making good decisions on your project. With context, this information helps to provide a sound foundation for making project decisions. Could you imagine trying to make important project decisions with raw data? No context provided? Just look at a sheet of numbers and try to make sense of it all? That would not be wise, and it would be crazy to assume that your stakeholders want to see raw data. They want to see usable, contextualized work performance information like deliverable status or change request implementation status, by which to gauge the performance of your project. Work performance information is circulated through the various communication processes that are in place on your project. Change requests are a formal proposal to modify any document, deliverable, or baseline. Change requests are almost a certainty on any project. Analysis of project performance and interactions with stakeholders often generates change requests as an output to this process. These change requests can be corrective actions, including changes to bring the expected future performance of the project in line with your project management plan. For example, a corrective action change request would be optimizing the code on a software project to calculate equations with the quoted time frame. Another example would be adding resources to a project to improve schedule performance. Or we could have preventive action change requests. These help reduce negative performance or reduce the probability of future negative project performance. One example of a preventive action would be to ensure that all permits are acquired before starting construction on a building project. Getting the permits before starting construction will prevent any possible delays or complaints from city or property managers. The project management plan is not only an input to this process, we also apply our expert judgment to it, and then we make updates to the plan. As stakeholders engage with the project, the overall effectiveness of the stakeholder management strategy can be evaluated. Changes in approach or strategy can be identified and applied. For instance, a stakeholder may tell you that he feels uninformed and that he is not really sure what this project is all about and where you are heading. This means you have to increase your regular communications with that stakeholder. As a consequence, you will update your communications management plan and address the information needs of this stakeholder accordingly. As such changes are identified, they must be reflected in the project management plan. If you don't change the plan, the changes will never be addressed. And as we just mentioned, if your stakeholder needs to be informed more frequently, but you never change your plan, what do you think is the chance that the stakeholder will later on feel better informed? Well, it's zero. If it isn't in the project management plan, then you are telling your stakeholders that their input is not important and that their needs are not even on your mind. Changes that you need to make may include a wide number of subsidiary plans in the project management plan, like you may need to make changes to the change management plan, the schedule baseline, or the stakeholder management plan, to name just a few. Our next output are the updates to our project documents, and you may be asking yourself, project document updates? Why? What will I update? Well, first of all, you will be updating the stakeholder register. This is updated as information on stakeholders change when new stakeholders are identified or if registered stakeholders are no longer involved or impacted by the project. The issues log is updated as new issues are identified and current issues are resolved, because you don't want to try and fix the same problem twice, right? Lastly, we also update organizational process assets, which are usually in the form of process descriptions, policies, procedures, and knowledge bases that are used in our organization. Here are some examples. First of all, stakeholder notifications. Information should be provided to stakeholders about resolved issues, approved changes, or even general project status. Then we have project reports. These can be formal or informal. You will describe the project status, include lessons learned, issues log, project closure reports, and so on. Of course, we will have project presentations. Again, these can be formal or informal. These presentations will be sent to the project stakeholders using information provided by the project team. Project records are next. These include things like correspondence, memos, meeting minutes, or other documents that describe the project. Of course, there will be feedback. This is feedback from stakeholders. Listening to this feedback is vitally important. This feedback is information from the stakeholders related to project operations, which will be used to modify or improve future performance of your project. And of course, we will also have lessons learned. The lessons learned documentation includes a root cause analysis of the issues that we faced on the project, the reasoning behind why the project manager chose a specific corrective action, and so on. The lessons learned are documented and distributed, and they become part of our historical database for the project and for our performing organization. And lastly, did you remember what I said on the first slide of our outputs. You know, the one with the purple arrow at the top where we just listed the outputs. I said, as we review each output, please remember that each of them is created to ensure effective and efficient stakeholder engagement. So let me remind you one more time. That is why we have all of these outputs. And there you have it, the control stakeholder engagement process. It wasn't as complicated as you may have thought, right? Well, let's review. We covered the main concept of this process, which is monitoring the overall project stakeholder relationships to keep our stakeholders engaged in the project. As you recall, a stakeholder is defined as an individual, group, or organization who may affect or be affected by or perceive itself to be affected by a decision, activity, or outcome on a project. We discussed the importance of documentation and communication on your project, covering things like change requests, status reports, and deliverable status. Raw data is turned into information, which is then used to update your documents and organizational process assets. Lessons are learned, information is recorded and shared, and future projects improve because of that. Remember, the project management plan must be updated with any necessary changes that the stakeholders have required. These could be changes in things like approach or strategy. And we talked about the lessons learned from this process as useful organizational process assets, which will be quite beneficial to future projects and other project managers. And at this point in our presentation, you may be asking yourself, now wait a minute, we just did the review. Why are we going back to this slide here, our overview of the processes and the process groups? Because we just finished control stakeholder engagement. That's the final process here in this knowledge area. Well, I was thinking to myself, this is not balanced well enough because, we have one process only in 4 of our 5 process groups. What if we had a 5th process? What if we had a closing process here in project stakeholder management? And my suggestion for an improvement for the PMBOK Guide 6th edition would be we need to add party with stakeholders as a closing process as well. And this concludes our look at the control stakeholder engagement process. Let's hear what Justine has to say.
Peace be with you.
Until next time.